So you're gearing up for your OP09 pre-release, ready to take home that winner Luffy, Ace, and Sabo, or maybe this is your first pre-release for the One Piece card game, and you're just generally asking yourself, what should I be looking for, and what should I be doing when I go to this event? Well, I've won over 50% of my sealed events in the One Piece card game, and I'm confident I can give you the tips you need to know to get there, have a great time, and maybe take home those winner cards. This is my OP09 pre-release guide. If you want to win this, you'll play this. First, let's go over some of the things you're going to learn in this guide. The first of it is just how is a pre-release played? If you've never played in one, you're gonna wanna know. Next is the most optimal choices you can make before you even sit down to play a game. Then we'll talk about the type of cards you should be looking at when it comes to building your deck, or they can be leveraged against you in your games. And finally, understanding the card pool and the specific gameplay environment of this exact pre-release OP09. We also have chapters in the timeline, so you can skip around if any of this information is repetitive because you played other events, or if you feel like you already have a good grasp of those mechanics. Now, disclaimer, this guide is designed specifically to help you win. It's breaking down the most efficient ways to get wins possible. But if anything I tell you doesn't sound fun, it's not embracing cards you want to play, or gameplay from the One Piece card game that makes you have a good time, you should just disregard it. This is a pre-release. This is a game, for God's sakes. At the end of the day, you should be doing what gives you the most fun experience. But just try to take all the other little tips I gave you along the way, try to incorporate them into what you're doing that gives you a good time, and you're going to get the most efficient and successful version of your deck and gameplay experience possible. So how is a pre-release played? Well, each player will receive 6 packs of the current set, in this case OP09, and one 2-card pack that includes 2 stamped promo cards that are either commons or uncommons from the set. You'll then open your packs, and using what you pull, you'll construct a 40-card deck plus a leader card. Now, when deck building, your deck may contain any color regardless of the color of your leader that you choose. But color and card types still matter for card effects. So for example, OP02's Buggy can still only search red event cards. And cards that require a specific subtype to either target, activate what they're searching for, or are required for the cost or activation of a card still require that card type. So from this set, Searcher Law can still only search Straw Hat and Heart Pirates cards, and leaders like OP08's Chopper can still only attach Rested Dawn to Animal and Drum Kingdom type characters. The cool thing about pre-release is that everything you need will be given to you when you get there, except for 2 things. First is your Dawn deck, and second is your leader. You must bring a leader that you own to play with, or you must play with a leader you pull from your packs. Now, this next point isn't exactly true for all stores, because every store will have a few modifiers, typically their own house rules, but the way the events are supposed to be run is that when you're playing in pre-release, you cannot play a leader from the set you're opening unless you open it in your packs. So let's say you went to 2 pre-releases, and in your first one you pulled the Shanks leader. You can't just bring that Shanks leader to your second event and say, hey, I already own this card, it's in my collection, I'm gonna play it for my leader. Typically that's how it works, but some stores do not care as much, so make sure to ask your local store what their house rules are. Next up are the viable leaders. These are the strongest leaders you can be playing in Limited. On S tier are the ones that are the godsends, the ones that beat it all, and normally Bonnie would be above all of them except for 2 new changes to the list coming into this event. But of course, at the top of S tier, we still have Jewelry Bonnie. I have an entire video I can link in the description for you guys that literally breaks down why she's so overpowered in Sealed. But basically, you get free card interaction and you generate free cards by the way you use her ability. Next is Zoro, which makes your smaller bodies bigger and makes your bigger bodies even bigger than that, with less 2Ks and counter power or general interaction in the set compared to Constructed. Zoro just incrementally adds so much value over the game that you're able to take over the game state easily. He's obviously stronger in sets that have more 3 to 4 cost characters to play, or even 2 4s, but in every set he can be an absolute menace. Katakuri is great because he swings for 7k on 1 Dawn plus gets information on what your opponent's drawing, or setting up your own life for triggers or cards you need in hand. The more good triggers there are in a set, the better Katakuri is at pre-release. Then there's Useless Captain Kid that can swing for 12k twice in a turn, even when you have no board, which means you can kill opponents out of nowhere no matter how much board control they do, and you can leverage him to effectively clamp down on a board state that got out of control early on with his double attack. Then we have the leaders that are viable in any pre-release, but they're not usually able to rumble with the top tier guys as often unless the set or your card pool is very specifically enabling them. Red Green Law is great if you have a set with lots of good value 4 and 5 drops and a bunch of 1 and 2 drops you can play to execute his ability over and over again. In Limited, we play a lot of vanilla characters, so leaders like Green Blue Sanji and Red Uda are great for taking over and just bolstering the ability of what should be the core of your deck anyway. Yamato has double attack printed right on it, plus an additional ability that helps boost your characters to push in more damage or control the board state. Viability really depends on how many blockers there are in the set, so pay attention to that stat later. NL, of course, is a cockroach as always, so he's able to just keep extending the game longer and longer with his life gain. Perona and Blue Croc have built-in interactions, so you're able to actually interact with your opponent's board without having interaction cards in your card pool, just the way the leader is printed. Blue Luffy just draws cards, which is pretty good on average in a limited environment. And new to the viable list is Nefertari Vivi, specifically because she helps out Jewelry Bonnie by playing characters with Rush after you make your first sets of attacks, so the Jewelry Bonnie can't really tamp down on your board, while also drawing cards in hand to replace them. It can definitely struggle against some of the other top tier, like Use's Captain Kidd, but because of Bonnie taking over such a large portion of the play pool, we've seen a lot more viability in her being played at pre-release. But that's not all, because we have 2 new challengers that are getting played for the first time in pre-release here, and that is the Red Sanji from Premium Booster and Shanks from the new OP09 set. Shanks, I think, is going to end up being on the viable list. He's kind of similar to Bonnie, where he generates virtual card advantage, where every time your opponent attacks once per turn, you get to minus something by 1,000. So your leader basically every turn on your opponent's turn generates a free 1k counter, which is going to add up over the course of the game, but I don't think is exactly game breaking. But in OP09, with a bunch of cards locked to Red Hair Shanks being the leader to activate their full abilities, he may be just way more powerful. Cards like Lucky Roo, for example, being able to be turned on for blocking and then KOing something because you have Shanks leader, seems pretty crazy. But Sanji, however, I think is going to be in our new S tier environment. He has activate main once per turn up to one of your characters without an on-play effect and cost 8 or less, gain Rush. So you're basically doing what Vivi's doing, except for you can attack with your leader at all times, and you don't have to pay Dawn to activate. Granted, your max is still 8 cost, just like Vivi is, because of the cost to activate Vivi's ability. But overall, it presents a more aggressive tempo throughout the game that I think is going to keep Bonnie in check and rival the other S tier leaders. So, here are things you should remember about playing sealed as opposed to playing a constructed game. The first is that your opponent will typically have less 2k counters than they do in a constructed game. This means swinging for 6k on a 5k leader is way more effective at dealing damage and pulling cards from your opponent's hands than in constructed, since more than not, they're going to be giving you 2 1k counters that they want to get out of it, rather than just 1 2k counter. And card advantage is generally less accessible than in constructed. Playing searchers is way more of a risk, as decks aren't fully stacked with the same card type to guarantee hitting. So your opponent will generally have less resources to leverage at any time. Another thing to note is that triggers are way more likely. Because of the lack of color restriction, any decent trigger typically makes the deck, because they have the ability to completely change the game's tempo and just rocket someone ahead with a trigger activation that was behind in the game. So be aware of your non-yellow opponents having trigger when you swing on life. We'll make sure to review how many relevant triggers there are in this set coming up. Also, power reduction is at a premium in sealed. You're more times than not fighting over board state than life to win the game. So being able to reduce the power of your opponent's characters to make your attacks more effective is extremely valuable. So when building your deck, here are things that always should go into it immediately. First is on-rate vanillas cost 3 or greater. This basically refers to any card that has 2,000 power more than the cost printed on it. So 3 cost characters with 5k power or 6 cost characters with 8k power. 2 or 1 cost characters that meet this criteria and don't have impactful effects typically won't make it unless you're playing Zoro, in which case going wide with his ability to make up for a 1k gap can be extremely powerful. Every single 2k counter you do open should make it in. The same goes for blockers. You should be playing every blocker you open because they help bridge the gap between the lack of counter power in your hand when it comes to your opponent swinging down with big characters. To also shore up a lack of 2k counters, any event that gives you 2k counter per 1 cost printed on it should make it in. So for example, if an event costs 2 and it gives 4k counter, like Dark Water in this set, you should definitely throw it into your deck. And then well-priced interaction. Cards that KO, power reduce, bottom deck, return to hand, freeze cards, or rest cards, to give you any opening to interact with your opponent's board or set them far behind on resources. As long as you feel like we're not overpaying. Obviously, you don't want to do something like paying 9 Dawn to KO at 3 cost, if you're not getting a body out of it as well. And then, like I said before, any good trigger, as long as they're good on board or good in your hand for counter and interaction, should make the deck. And when you're playing a leader like Useless Captain Kid that looks to trash cards to activate his effect, you can usually get away with playing a lot more subpar triggers when they're not being triggered, because you can always trash them to cost for his ability. So when it comes to the important cards we're looking to deck build around, here's what we have in OP09. We have 2 2K counters that are rare or above. Rare or above being cards that are rare, super rare, secret rare, or SP in the set. And 12 2K counters that are under rare, so common or uncommon, which is a lot for a sealed environment. So be aware, we're gonna have a lot more 2K counters than typical in this set. We have 5 blockers that are rare or above, and 8 that are under rare. We actually have 0 free roll characters in this set. Free roll characters are characters that free play themselves, usually from a trigger activation. We do have a whole bunch of Revolutionary Army cards that can do it, but their conditions are so narrow that I don't consider them part of this list because they're not going to trigger until the very end of the game, whereas typically we look at free roll characters being characters that can be on the first life even. Really interesting is that we actually have 5 cards that have Rush in this set, but they're all rare or above. So it's going to be more uncommon for you and your opponent to have them, but still always remember that they're out there. When it comes to removal, cards that make cards leave the board, we have 10 that are rare or above and 6 that are under rare. For resters, we have 1 that's above and 3 that's under rare. Cards that freeze, we have 2 that are rare or above and 0 cards that aren't rare and above that freeze. We have 1 good trigger card that's rare or above and 4 under rare, which is a little low overall for a set compared to the last few we've had. So you could probably play a little more liberally when it comes to considering triggers in life. And finally, for power reducers that are proactive, so ones you can activate on your turn, not power reduction that happens as like a form of counter, we have 3 that are rare or above and 4 that are under rare. So now that we've gone over all the basics and key metrics, let's review some of the standout cards specifically for sealed in OP09. And closer to pre-release, I will be doing an entire stream where I review every single card in OP09, specifically through the lens of pre-release. If you want to see all the cards in the set right now, and you don't care about us talking about it in the form of pre-release, we do have our set color guides up for you to view. But these are the OP09 standouts that I think you should be aware of, and lead towards cards you wouldn't normally be aware of because they're not extremely powerful necessarily in constructed. First is the new Sachi and Penguin. 4 cost 5k power, 1k counter, and when attacking, up to one of your opponent's characters gets minus 2000 power for the turn. So they're a lethal body that can attack leader. Plus they offer free power reduction. Once they're on the board and they're attacking, you don't have to pay any Dawn or equip any Dawn, which can make it really easy to get over some of your opponent's rested characters. And this card is a common, so it's going to be running around everywhere. So make sure you understand how the tempo of the game is going to change up as these hit the board. Now, this card is obviously powerful in constructed as well, but I have to flag it because it is probably the boss character of OP09 set. Shanks is a 10 cost, 12,000 power character with all opponents' characters get minus 1,000 power and rush. So he is a large rush body. The turn you play him, he's immediately going to take something out on the board more times than not, and he's going to be hard to remove on the opposing turn. Plus, with his static ability giving minus 1,000 power to all your opponent's characters, both on your turn and the opponent's turn, he's generating virtual card advantage for every single combat that happens that involves a character on your opponent's board. Because let's say you have Shanks on your board, every single swing your opponent makes on you with a character, you need 1,000 less counter to get out of it. And every time you swing on one of their rested characters, they're going to need 1,000 more power to get out of it. And since he's a super rare, you're going to see more of these than you'd like to if you go to multiple events. Next is Yasop. He's a lethal body as a 5/6 with 1,000 counter. And on play, he gives up to one of your leaders 1,000 power until the end of your opponent's next turn. Plus Dawn when attacking to reduce a character by 1,000 power. So again, similar to Shanks when you do the on play, he's going to generate 1,000 counter for every single attack your opponent would make on the next turn. Not to mention, you're going to be swinging with your leader as at least a 6k the turn you play him. And after that, he starts reducing cards on board to make it easier to remove them from play. With him at rare, this should be a pretty common card you're going to see throughout the event, so make sure to remember how the tempo of the game changes up when Yasop hits the board. Next, we have Green Sakazuki, and this is probably the cleanest removal card we have in the set. He's a 6/7 with on play. If you have 2 or more rested characters, KO up to one of your opponent's characters at a cost of 5 or less. 5 or less is a pretty great range to be targeting here in Limited, meaning even if you could already kill a smaller body that's threatening you, you can ignore it and swing at bigger bodies or swing at leader, knowing that Sakazuki will clean it up. And since it can reach all the way up to 5, it can kill up to a 7k power character. The only thing is that typically they're not going to play it on 6 Dawn turns because they probably won't have 2 rested characters to go along with it, but it's definitely possible, so be ready for that. We also have the new Don Quixote do Flamingo, a 5 cost 6,000 power character with 1k counter and blocker, plus end of turn if you have 2 or more rested characters, set this character as active. Now notably, this counts himself, so you only need 1 other rested character on board to set him as active. So he's a lethal body that can also block, and he blocks above 5k, so he can actually invalidate attacks on leader, but most importantly, he can attack and block in 1 turn cycle. He is rare, so your opponent shouldn't be stacking multiple of these, but he's definitely a house in pre-release. Next is the new Monkey D. Luffy, a 5/6 with 1000 counter, and on play if you have 2 or more rested characters, rest one of your opponent's characters with a cost of 6 or less, or 1 Dawn. So he's a lethal body that also does proactive resting while building out your board and swinging on your opponent. Notably, he's bad at getting around blockers for your other characters to get in for attacks. But you can attack with your characters, rest the target you want to rest, whether it's a blocker or a threat, and then have your leader swing into it. Overall, just happy with this card, and it's a common, so it's a pretty nice addition to anyone's deck. Next on the Croc, he's a 7/7 with 1k counter, and on play up to 1 character from your hand with a cost of 5 or lower, that includes Cross Guild or Baroque Works type. So basically, he's really important because he's a large body that enables multiplay. So for the 1 card you play, you're gonna get 2 characters out of it, which is always pretty good, but it's really important with Bonnie in the meta because multiplying is one of the few ways you can really out an opponent's Bonnie from controlling your board state. Coming up next is Kozaki Oden, a 9 cost 10,000 power character with double attack, and on KO draw 2 cards and then trash 1 card. I think it's pretty obvious this is an end game body at 9 costs 10,000 power, but having double attack means he's great for ending the game fast after you spend a lot of time focusing on your opponent's board. Plus, with the KO trigger filtering and giving you card advantage to replace himself, if your opponent actually removes it, you're kind of back where you started and you took away some of their tempo. And realistically, the only card that's going to get around this KO trigger is Ben Beckman, which requires additional reduction on top. Next, we have Moji and Richie. Moji is a 5 cost 5,000 power character with 2k counter, and on play, look at the top 5 cards of your deck and add a Richie card to your hand. Then place the rest at the bottom of your deck in any order. Then you may play up to 1 Richie from your hand. I don't know why this translation on One Piece top decks was missing this text, but swear to God, that's how it works. So you get to add a Richie, and whether you add one or not, if there's one in your hand, you can then play it. And Richie's a 2 cost 2,000 power character with blocker. So this card, Moji specifically, is all around great. He's a 2k counter, he's a lethal body that attacks leader, and he multiplays to get around Bonnie while maintaining hand size. Most importantly, while he is an uncommon, Richie is a common. So even if you only pull 1 Moji, you can be very likely to have multiple Richies that hit off the ability for the 1 copy of Moji you have. Then there's Special Muggy Ball, which again has a translation issue, so I'll kind of break it down. It's a 2 cost main event that says your opponent returns one of their characters cost 6 or less to their owner's hand. Specifically, the way it's translated here is incorrect because your opponent is the one that chooses which card is getting returned to their hand. But the trigger is correct. It says return 1 character with a cost of 3 or less to the owner's hand. That one would be your choice. This card is still great priced at 2 though. It's a huge tempo game. You can spend your turn cleaning up a lot of the smaller bodies and then pay 2 to make them return their last big body, cost 4, 5, or 6, to their hand. Then you can easily clean up any of your opponent's 4, 5, or 6 cost character, returning up to an 8,000 power card to their hand for 2. It's similar to why multiplaying is really good against the Bonnie player. Being able to cheaply remove a major threat they need to have established on board to help control the board state is also a great card against them. And if you come from Magic the Gathering, this is literally a bounce edict, and you know how powerful edicts can be in the right player's hands. Following that, we have 7 cost Sanji, a 7 cost 7,000 power character with 1,000 counter, and on play you may return 1 or more of your Dawn cards to the Dawn deck. This character gains rush for the turn, then rest up to one of your opponent's 6 cost or lower characters. So a 7/7 rush is already great in limited, but he can remove blockers or rest down a character your opponent just played and attack it down before they can leverage it for value. This is an all-around heavy hitter and will do a ton of work for you or against you. Next is Tony Chopper, and for the same reason as our Dofi, he is amazing, but he's an uncommon, which means you're going to see a lot more of him running around. He's a 5 cost, 6,000 power character with 1k counter, and at the end of your turn, you may return 1 or more Dawn cards from the field to your Dawn deck. Then you get to set this character as active, and then this character gains blocker until the end of your opponent's turn. So like Dofi, he can attack and block in 1 turn cycle. He's uncommon, so having multiple isn't that insane, and a 5/6 is a great statted body for something you want to attack and defend with. Definitely be aware of Chopper. He is Bokura doctoring his way to a first place pre-release finish. This new Brook is also really fantastic in limited. He's a 6 cost 7k power character with 1k counter, and when attacking you may return 1 or more Dawn to the Dawn deck. Then you get to give minus 2,000 to up to 2 of your opponent's characters for the turn. So he's already a large body to threaten leader or other characters, but with that reduction and multiple reduction targets, he can really help you clear board of big and small characters alike. Combine this with the red removal cards that are in this set, which are not typically supposed to be played with this card, but because of not having color restrictions for deck building, you can easily do so. And this Brook as a common is a whole entire house. It's like a mansion, bro. Then there's a new Roronoa Zoro, a 3 cost 5,000 power character with on play return 1 or more Dawn cards from your field to the Dawn deck and add up to 1 Dawn from your Dawn deck as active. Now it may not seem that impressive outside of a black purple Luffy leader, but for limited it's great. Not only can you play a 3/5 going first on 3 Dawn and still swing for 6 with your leader, forcing a 2k or early life, but late game he helps you multiply. He essentially is a 2/5 in the late game when you play him first and then play another body to help you get around Bonnie or have enough attackers to close out the game out of nowhere. Now I'll be real, black is pretty weak in this set. There's a lot of restrictions to your leader, and I really don't think the Blackbeard leader is at a great place in limited, but Van Augur is a pretty good card as a 5/6 rare with 1,000 counter. You can't really activate the main, but he does replace himself on KO to draw a card, so he's a typical lethal buy that replaces himself. I think he's just great filler all around, but there are way more rares I would like to see. But just wanted to point out that out of all the black and especially Blackbeard cards, this is the best one in pre-release that isn't, 10-drop Blackbeard because it's a big 10-drop boss monster. Nico Robin is such an important card in pre-release, especially at rare. It's a 6/6 with 1k counter, and on play, if your opponent has 3 or more life cards, trash 1 card from the top of their life. Plus a trigger to play a 3 cost or less yellow character from your hand to help you immediately spit out a body out of nowhere. This is a lethal attacker. It trashes life, so when it comes into play, it will immediately get rid of it where your opponent gets 0 value, no trigger activation, no adding it to hand to play or counter with. And for when she's supposed to play on her Dawn curve for 6 Dawn, you are definitely in the point of the game where you should still be focusing on your opponent's board. So while building out yours to continue the pressure, you automatically just get rid of a life without having to waste any of your attacks. This card is huge. And then we have Dare Shishishi, which, isn't like super powerful, but it does draw 2 cards for 3 essentially if you feel like you have enough triggers in your deck to search. So just upgrading this into 2 1Ks to have a guaranteed 2K, or splitting them between playing cards on board and having counter power, or digging for trigger event cards that happen to have really impactful main abilities like your special Muggy Ball, could be really powerful, but this is a lot more deck building and what's in your card pool dependent than a lot of the other cards we just talked about. As usual, the secret rares in a set are no joke when it comes to limited play, so I just want to make sure we highlight them since traditionally they'll be less floating around, but they can absolutely screw up your whole day. Goldie Roger is a 10 cost 13,000 power character with rush, so you'll be immediately smacking in, and if you want to try to block him to not die, if you declare blocker at any point and you or your opponent is at 0 life, they'll just win the game. So make sure you're considering that if your opponent is playing in what you feel like is a pretty odd way. And then the new Monkey D. Luffy is a 10,000 power character with 9 cost. And on play, you may return 1 or more Dawn cards from play to your Dawn deck. You then draw a card to replace him, and then he gains Rush. Typically, they'll just Dawn -1, so it's a 9 cost Dawn -1, which means they're at 10 again on the following turn. Get a 10,000 power Rush character and replace itself for counter power or more threats. Both extremely impactful cards. Make sure you do not give your opponent an opening to randomly win the game with them. And normally I don't go over the SPs, but this one is hyper specific because most of the time the SPs in a set are reprints that do similar things. They're KOing, they're bouncing, they're doing things that other cards in the set are doing that you need to already look out for. This is the one exception. This is the 10 cost Luffy from OP09 that lets you on play Dawn -10, return all characters you control to the bottom of your deck, then take an extra turn. Plus once per turn, pay 1 active Dawn to ramp an active Dawn. Unlike characters having Rush, this card actually changes the way that it kills you out of nowhere. because of how gaining an extra turn gives you this 12,000 attacker plus an additional leader attack, and they could try to get you to block with, let's say, a 6,000 power blocker that isn't unrested on the following turn when you untap with leader and get to attack with this card. So very low chance you're going to run into it, but it is out there and does play completely differently as every other card would. So I just wanted to make sure you were aware of it. And that is it for my OP09 pre-release guide. Like I said, we'll have a stream closer to the pre-release events where I'm going to go over just every single card in the set with you guys. You can ask me any questions live, which are great, or in the comment section down below if you feel like I wasn't clear about anything or you have a question about any specific cards. And as always, if you're looking for more fun One Piece content, check out the channel and subscribe.